So we've just heard from Luke chapter 8, verse 40 to 56. What do we learn about Jesus and crisis from this passage? Maybe you can tell us a little bit of what a crisis is.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for asking. As we get to know Jesus in the Bible, what we see is that he's always in control. And disasters, as he meets them, he just simply deals with them. There are two different crises in the passage. First of all, Jairus, he's a leader, a somebody, and his only daughter is gravely ill. She's about to die. His crisis is urgent and his crisis is time critical. That's the first crisis. The second crisis is a bleeding woman. She's been unwell for 12 years. She's probably ashamed and humiliated. She's probably a nobody in society. She's hoping to stay anonymous in a crowd of people. She's tried everything and no one could help her. Her crisis is long suffering and no respite, and there's no hope in sight.
Yeah, so they both come to Jesus, Jairus and the bleeding woman. How does Jesus deal with each situation?
Yeah, so they've both come to Jesus, it seems, as their last resort. They're very different people with very different situations, and both of them come to Jesus desperate for their individual crises to be dealt with. And as I mentioned before, he deals with it almost anticlimactically. The woman touches the edge of his cloak and then instantly she's healed. And Jairus, his daughter, when Jesus eventually gets to her, he just takes her by the hand and says, "Get up." And she's healed. Those crises are both just dealt with.
So yeah, we've seen that it's pretty amazing, right? The way Jesus responds to each situation. How should we then respond to Jesus?
Yeah, great question. How should we respond? In each crisis, what we see is Jesus calls the people who are affected to trust him. In verse 50, Jesus says to Jairus, "Jairus, don't be afraid, just believe or have trust." And to the terrified woman, she's trembling and fearful, and Jesus comforts her. He says, "Daughter, your faith or your trust has healed you. Go in peace." And so both of these situations, in the face of crisis, Jesus calls people, and I think he calls us too, to trust him and to succumb to fear of the situations that we're in.
So why do you think that's an appropriate response?
Yeah, great question. The passage shows us that Jesus is capable of dealing with whatever crisis is thrown with him. In these cases, they're both medical crises. But if you just read earlier in the chapter, Jesus has calmed a storm, a crisis of nature, and just by speaking, he does that. Also, just a few verses earlier, he demonstrates his power over evil by healing a demon-possessed person. And if you look for yourself in the Bible, Jesus is bigger than any problem. Time and time and time again, he's not hostage to sickness or evil or the forces of nature. Over again, Jesus demonstrates that he alone is capable of dealing with any crisis. And so I think that's part of the reason why we can trust him, and that is an appropriate response. And that's my question to you all today. Will you trust Jesus? And if not, why not? We've seen that our response to a crisis, and actually any crisis, any situation, our response should be trust in Jesus, because he's the only one who can be trusted all the time. He's the only one who is powerful over everything. Ultimately, if you keep reading the Bible and if you see as you follow Jesus' story, he shows that he has power over sin and death. And that is our biggest crisis. That's the crisis that we all will have to face. Sooner or later, we will have to face the consequences of our sin, and that is death. That's our biggest crisis. And we talked a bit about that last week, and it's alluded to. It was alluded to then. But if we keep reading about Jesus, and if we keep following the story of Luke's Gospel or other parts of the Bible, we see that Jesus emphatically, he so clearly conquers sin and death by dying and rising again. And so Jesus shows us over and over again that he alone is the one that we should trust in a time of crisis. And so my question once again is, will you trust